I'm very pleased to be here and to have spent the last week here for the geoeconomic seminar that we had over the weekend, and then I've stayed on for a couple of days specifically to deliver this talk. Southeast Asia is an extremely complex region. I know this region is complex, but I think what is fascinating about Southeast Asia is that it is extremely diverse. It's got a lot of countries in it. It has 10 or 11 constituent states, 11 if you include Timor-Leste. It's diverse in terms of the political systems of the countries in the region, or perhaps more accurately, sub-region. It's diverse in terms of their historical background and in terms of their cultures, including the religions of people in the region. And also it's diverse in terms of the levels of socioeconomic achievement, and yet again in terms of the international and regional orientations of Southeast Asian states. Just very briefly to give you an impression of the diversity of Southeast Asia, this region includes Singapore, which is, at least on paper, one of the world's most developed countries. And at the other end of the spectrum, it includes Laos and Myanmar, which are two of the world's poorest countries. It includes the world's most populous Muslim country, Indonesia, which has a population of, well, no one really knows how many people live in Indonesia, but the official figure is something like 229 million people, 90% of whom are Muslim, and also other major countries, Thailand, which is a Buddhist country, the Philippines, which is Asia's most prominent Christian country, and countries which have extremely complex ethnic and religious makeups, like Malaysia, which has a majority Muslim population, but also a very large Chinese minority of about 25% and 10% Indian. It includes extremely large states like Indonesia and extremely small ones like Timor-Leste, which has a population of a few hundred thousand. It has countries which were colonized by the British, the French, and the Dutch, but also includes Thailand, which was never colonized. So it is an extremely diverse and complicated region. That means that it's actually quite difficult to generalize about Southeast Asia because the variations are so large. Southeast Asia is sometimes referred to nowadays as ASEAN. I really don't like that. ASEAN is the acronym for the regional grouping, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and to a greater or lesser extent, ASEAN has become a significant feature of its member states' foreign policy over the last 45 years. But ASEAN is not the be-all and end-all of Southeast Asia and its constituent states. They have other interests and other orientations quite separate from ASEAN. And the differences in perspective and the differences in policy between the various Southeast Asian countries have actually bedeviled efforts to establish common ASEAN postures, particularly on political and security issues. Well, the main aim of this talk today is to assess some recent developments in Southeast Asian states' politics and societies. I think this will underline the danger of generalizing about the sub-region and at the same time indicate that this is a region in the midst of important changes which may have some significant implications for security and stability. Some of the security implications I'll mention as I go along. Others will come at the end of the talk when I try and summarize what I see as the main ramifications. Well, I've emphasized the diversity of Southeast Asia, but it's also true, and here comes a generalization, that in different ways, the peoples of a number of Southeast Asian countries are pushing for more accountable, more responsive governments. In other words, they are pushing for greater democracy. This is part of a long-term trend in Southeast Asia towards more democratic political systems that has been apparent since the 1970s. It reflects in part the long-term impact of economic change feeding through into social change and then ultimately into political change. And at the same time, related to that, the growth of a more demanding and politically conscious middle class in several Southeast Asian countries. But the process has not been smooth by any means. The case of Thailand is interesting. In Thailand, the development of democracy can be traced back to the overthrow by the army of the absolute monarchy in 1932, almost 80 years ago. The absolute monarchy was replaced by a constitutional monarchy, which was rather weak for some decades. The military became the most powerful political actor in the country. During the 1950s, the military set in train a process of changes in economic policy that emphasized the development of a non-state sector in the economy. It opened the way for private enterprise to play a much greater economic role, which led during the 1960s and early 1970s to really quite rapid growth in Thailand's economy and the beginnings of significant changes in Thai society that saw the growth of a middle class, the growth of tertiary education, the growth of consumer demand. And by the mid-1970s, this contributed to a major revolt by liberals and leftists, trade unions, students, and the temporary overthrow of the military-dominated political system. Over the last 35 years, Thai politics has developed in rather a halting fashion. There have been periods of democracy, there have been periods of military reassertion, and I think it would be very foolish to commit oneself to saying that the military will never re-intervene in Thai politics. The military looms large in the Thai political system. For many years, Thai politics was seen largely in terms of a dialectic involving the army and their conservative political allies on one side and pro-democracy forces on the other. But over the last decade, since 2001, when Thaksin Shinawatra became Prime Minister, a new dynamic has emerged. The schism in Thai politics is now between, on the one side, Thaksin's welfarist populism, and on the other side, the more traditional forces of the monarchical establishment, the army, and also to some extent liberal political forces. So there is a new schism in Thai society, and to some extent there is also a regional division, with the north and northeast of the country highly populous, relatively poor, backing Thaksin and his successive political parties, and a significant proportion of Bangkok's population is also pro-Thaksin. At the same time, on the other hand, there is a significant support in Bangkok and central Thailand for the traditional, more conservative political forces. There is a real fear in Thailand, particularly in the army and in what you might call establishment political forces, that the domination of Thailand's political scene by Thaksin and his current manifestation in political party forms, the Pheu Thai party, could play into an eventual monarchical succession crisis in a dangerous and destabilizing way. There is quite a common fear in Thailand, which is only expressed often in indirect ways, that when a monarchical succession in Thailand eventually occurs, this will remove what has been an important check on Thaksin's political dominance, and this could enable him to assume unparalleled and unchecked power. Now, these fears may be illusory, but it is an important part of what you might call a sort of implicit political discourse in Thailand. What is clear is that in successive elections, a majority of Thai people have voted in support of Thaksin and his political parties. Given the opportunity, they persistently vote him and his proxies back into power. Most recently, that happened in July this year, when the Pheu Thai party, led by Thaksin's sister, Yingluck Shinawatra, won a really resounding victory, a landslide. I think the hope now is that Yingluck Shinawatra, as Prime Minister, can successfully use her policies to engineer a form of national reconciliation which will take the sharp edges off the confrontation between the two major blocks in Thai politics, which are now color-coded as the yellows, in other words, the conservative, more royalist forces, and on the other hand, the reds, the populist forces associated with Thaksin. The signs so far are moderately encouraging. We've seen, for example, the new Prime Minister going out of her way to demonstrate her respect for the king and the monarchy. But divisions in Thai society and politics remain deep, and Thaksin, who is presently in exile, and I think it's widely known that he spends a lot of time in the Middle East and specifically in Dubai. If he was to return from exile, this could trigger a new crisis in Thailand, and of course the eventual royal succession, whenever that might happen, is another major looming problem that could take Thai political divisions to the brink again. There's an altogether different political scene in the country to the west of Thailand, Myanmar. Myanmar has had no democracy for the last 50 years since the military took control in 1962. There were elections in 1990. The National League for Democracy, led by Aung San Suu Kyi, won a landslide victory, but the results were overruled by the military, which reasserted its power. Subsequently, Aung San Suu Kyi has gained the status of being a democracy icon worldwide, and she has spent much of the last 21 years in detention or under house arrest. And as a result of the widespread human rights abuses in Myanmar, the country has been effectively isolated from economic links with the West. It's been under embargo by the United States and the European Union, and as a result, it has come to rely extremely heavily on economic and political links with China, and to a lesser extent with India and other Southeast Asian countries. There was a constitutional referendum in 2008, followed by national elections in November last year, these were widely seen as being superficial gestures by the military regime to enhance its legitimacy, and they led in March this year to the swearing in of a nominally civilian government led by President Thein Sein. Now, most people in Myanmar, as well as outside observers, were extremely skeptical about these developments in Myanmar's political scene, especially because Aung San Suu Kyi's National League for Democracy had not been allowed to contest the elections. However, I think that developments over the course of this year have caused many of us to really quite fundamentally reassess our positions. Within days of the March elections, Aung San Suu Kyi was released from house arrest and was subsequently allowed to travel quite widely within Myanmar and to speak to her supporters, her constituency. And there have been additional positive developments recently, particularly the freeing of 200 or 300 political detainees last week. There have been lively debates in Myanmar's parliament, which has turned out not to be as rigged as many people expected. Of course, most people in Myanmar remain suspicious of the regime, as do outside observers, but it does seem that there are real changes underway in Myanmar now. The interesting question is what explains this apparent change of course on the part of the Burmese military? Well, I have three suggestions. One is that the military leadership wish to avoid over-reliance on China. They remain at heart nationalists, and they've seen that over the last 20 years, Myanmar has become dangerously subservient to China, and this has provoked domestic unease amongst Myanmar's people. One example recently concerns China's plans to build a dam which would have affected a major dam that would have affected the livelihood of many millions of Myanmar people living downstream. And within the last week, the regime has changed its policy on that and has asked the Chinese to reconsider construction of this dam, and this has provoked a diplomatic spat with Beijing. This is a significant development, that the regime is self-consciously putting the interests of Myanmar's people ahead of large-scale business deals with China. Secondly, I think there's a recognition in the regime in Myanmar that a broader engagement with the global economy is needed to develop the country. The military elite in Myanmar has had the opportunity over the last 20 years to travel often to other Southeast Asian countries, particularly since Myanmar joined ASEAN in the late 1990s. They're well aware of how far their country has fallen behind their Southeast Asian partners, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, and even now Vietnam and Indonesia are doing much better than Myanmar. And there's a recognition that if Myanmar is to progress and make sanctions need to be lifted, and there needs to be engagement with the West. And I think, thirdly, there has been a fear for some time in the upper echelons of Myanmar's armed forces that if the political situation in the country again deteriorated into outright confrontation between the regime and the people as a result of a popular revolt, then more extreme forms of Western intervention going beyond sanctions could not be entirely discounted. And that seems far-fetched. I think the notion of the United States or other Western countries seriously considering some form of intervention in Myanmar is an incredible notion. Yet, I think there are indications that Myanmar's generals have been thinking along these lines for some time. And one indication is the move of the capital. Yangon is no longer the capital of Burma. It was moved several years ago to a place called Naypyidaw, in a fairly remote area of the country. Part of the reason being, apparently, that the Myanmar military leadership felt that Naypyidaw would be much more defensible in the event of some sort of Western intervention or attack on the country. At the very other end of the spectrum of socioeconomic development in Southeast Asia is Singapore. Under the leadership of the People's Action Party, and in its, more specifically, in the early years of Singapore's independence, Lee Kuan Yew, the country, or city-state, has made remarkable progress. It is not really a country. It is a small island which is almost entirely taken up with the city of Singapore. It's a small country. It has a population of 5 million. It has progressed economically to become one of the world's richest countries in terms of average per capita GDP. Its economy has diversified. It's no longer dependent, as it was in the 1970s and 80s, simply on manufacturing, office equipment and computers. Several other sectors of the economy have become equally important, and it's demonstrated sustained growth for many years, and it bounced back very quickly from the Asian financial crisis of the late 1990s and the global financial crisis of 2008. And I think until very recently, it would have been assumed that the dominance of the People's Action Party was assured. It was providing the goods. It was a classic example of what you might call performance legitimacy. And there were no real alternatives. But there's been a startling turnaround during the course of this year. There have been really startling gains for the previously weak political opposition in both the May general election and then in August this year, the presidential election. And I think this has profoundly changed Singapore's political equation. How did this happen? Well, some people have looked at the way that electronic media were used widely for uninhibited political discussion by a richer, more sophisticated, more cosmopolitan and much more demanding electorate. Well, that's part of the reason, and it's certainly true that the criticism of the PAP government has been uninhibited. But I think there are much deeper reasons. At the grassroots level in Singapore, the government is now widely felt to be out of touch. It's been out of touch on a number of key issues for ordinary Singaporeans, on the cost of housing. Until quite recently, ordinary Singaporeans could aspire to own a comfortable government-provided flat, and if they did well, to move out into a private condominium, and perhaps even to own a house with some land. Within the last few years, even owning a government flat has become an unattainable dream for some Singaporeans. Public transport. Public transport was one of Singapore's great amenities until recently. It still is. There's a mass rapid transport system that's been developed over the last 20 years. But what wasn't factored into the public transport equation was the government's parallel plan to expand the population through immigration. When I lived in Singapore for the first time in the late 1980s, the population was 3.2 million. 25 years later, the population is 5.2 million, and it's rising rapidly. This is explicitly not happening through the growth of the Singaporean population, but through fairly large-scale immigration, particularly from China and India. And this has contributed to a really quite strong sense of resentment. This has blown back in the face of the government, and there is a strong sense amongst many ordinary Singaporeans that the government is putting foreigners before Singaporeans. There are a number of specific gripes. One example would be that all male Singaporeans, when they're 18, have to do 2 years national service in the Singapore Armed Forces, and then for 10 years after they leave national service, they have to do several weeks reservist service every year. Permanent residents and other new residents of Singapore do not have to do that. So it's quite possible to come into Singapore, have a job, even become a permanent resident, and you have no commitment to national service. So a lot of ordinary Singaporeans are saying, why are we doing this when they don't have to? So the PAP government is now facing a credible and legitimate challenge which may well grow stronger if it fails to respond appropriately. Of course, in the elections, the PAP still secured a huge majority of the parliamentary seats. There is no immediate challenge, but their vote in the general election this year fell to the lowest since independence, and the opposition parties gained a significant number of seats, about 10% of the overall seats in Parliament for the first time. And this was followed several months later coincidentally by the presidential election. This happens every 5 years. The PAP's candidate for the presidency almost lost. I mean, it was literally a few thousand votes difference between the PAP's candidate and effectively one of the opposition candidates. I mentioned political developments in several other Southeast Asian countries relatively briefly. In Singapore's neighbour Malaysia, there have been major changes over the last 3 or 4 years. The March 2008 elections saw unprecedented gains for the opposition coalition. It's a broad-ranging coalition that has, on one side, the Islamic Party, and on the other, at the other end of the spectrum, the DAP, which is a liberal pro-democracy party, and then in the middle, a relatively new party led by Anwar Ibrahim, who is the overall leader of the opposition coalition. To some extent, over the last 3.5 years, the opposition in Malaysia has been undermined by Anwar's poor leadership and the fact that he has been compromised by criminal proceedings against him. But despite that, the causes of popular opposition to Malaysia's government remain largely unresolved, and they will continue to be a source of strength for the opposition as the country moves towards the next general election, which must be held by 2013. I think the main wellspring of opposition is a sense that the coalition government which is in power has simply been in power too long. It's been in power since independence in 1957. It has become allegedly corrupt, and it has ceased to provide for the interests of ordinary Malaysians. It has been successful in creating a strong middle class, but life for the majority of ordinary Malaysians remains hard. The Malaysian government is already courting opposition voters within the last few weeks, a couple of developments are noteworthy. There was an announcement that the Internal Security Act will be repealed, although in brackets it will be replaced by several new acts to curb against extremism and subversion. And in the government's recent budget within the last few days, it was revealed that major defense procurement projects will be shelved in favor of a greater emphasis on social and development spending, and that's really quite a significant development. Then there is Southeast Asia's potential major power, Indonesia. Indonesia has been successful by many measures under President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono since 2004. He is now more than halfway through his second term, which ends in 2014. He cannot stand for a third term. There's been fast economic growth as a result of a boom in energy and commodity prices. Foreign investment has grown. Indonesia has become a member of the G20, and some people see it as almost an honorary member of the BRICS category of large, fast-growing states. But it still has major problems. It needs much greater investment in labor-intensive sectors. There's widespread corruption, bureaucratic inefficiency. The infrastructure is inadequate. There have been political successes. Democratic elections have become institutionalized. The government is now accountable. The military has withdrawn from politics. The insurgency in the province of Aceh has been resolved. Communal violence in eastern Indonesia has stopped. And there's been a process of large-scale administrative and fiscal devolution, which has undermined separatism in most parts of the country. The Indonesian government's counter-terrorism campaign has been widely seen as successful. But there are still real problems, and on the security side, there is an atmosphere of weak law enforcement, which has allowed Islamic militancy to thrive, and that may be contributing to some new outbreaks of Islamic terrorism over the last year. There's also been an upsurge in violence in the province of Papua, which was integrated into Indonesia in quite dubious circumstances in 1962. Rising separatist sentiment and now a large-scale strike by workers at the hugely important Freeport mine has led to fears that the conflict is really quite seriously escalating. In the last part of my talk, I'm going to look more specifically at the implications of these domestic developments in Southeast Asian countries for security and stability. Just very briefly, my thoughts on this are as follows. First of all, the impact on internal security is as varied as the countries and governments concerned. In Thailand, the Yingluck government seems unlikely to make a substantial impact on the insurgency in the south of the country. In Myanmar, a new political environment involving greater freedoms could also lead to new ceasefires with ethnic minority rebel groups. In the Philippines, the Aquino administration's strong focus on peace building brings some hope of resolving the New People's Army and Moro Islamic Liberation Front rebellions. Secondly, in this sub-region of incomplete, unstable, insecure, and emerging democracies, there is a real danger of bilateral disputes between Southeast Asian countries. We've seen this from time to time in relations between Malaysia and various of its neighbors, particularly Indonesia, and more dangerously over the last year between Thailand and Cambodia, which have had a low-key border war going on. However, domestic political change can sometimes offer the possibility of quite quickly pushing bilateral disputes onto the back burner again. And I think we've seen this since the Yingluck government took over in Thailand. This has led to a rapid improvement in relations with Cambodia. Thirdly, some see the gradual democratization of Southeast Asia as holding out the possibility of the regional association, ASEAN, becoming more effective because of the growth of common values and outlooks among its members. But this is going to be an extremely drawn-out process. For a start, some Southeast Asian states are still a long way from any sort of democracy or political progress. Even if Myanmar made some sort of real democratic transition, countries such as Vietnam, Laos, and Brunei will remain non-democracies. There is no sign of significant political ferment. And others will remain fragile and unstable for years to come. So, for the foreseeable future, and despite the avowed intent to create what's referred to as an ASEAN community by the year 2015, I think we must accept that despite its status as the most successful regional organization after the EU, I'm not sure what sort of commendation that is, but ASEAN is widely portrayed as the number 2 regional grouping in the world. ASEAN is going to remain unable to provide a basis for its members to stand up to major regional security challenges. And major regional security challenges are emerging, particularly as a result of the shifting regional balance of power, notably China's manifestly growing assertiveness, which is already being felt in the context of the territorial dispute in the South China Sea, which involves several ASEAN countries, notably Vietnam, the Philippines, and Malaysia. And finally, one key implication of this probable continuing incoherence of ASEAN and other forms of regional association is that Southeast Asian states' individual security relationships with outside partners, and particularly the US, are going to remain crucially important for them. And in some cases, they may intensify their relationships with outside partners. And I think we've already seen this in the case of the Singapore-US security relationship. And of course, the United States and Vietnam continue their tentative and rather ironic courtship in the security sphere. On that note, I'll stop talking and give you the chance at last to ask some questions. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Tim. I'll take the questions one at a time, and I think we'll have Tim address them as they crop up. But as the chair, I'll take the prerogative of asking the first question. You touched on it at the very end of the talk, and that is the role of China. And do you see a more assertive China driving the ASEAN countries together to work for a kind of a comprehensive security with each member contributing in a practical way? Or do you see it fracturing the ASEAN community and forcing many of the members to take on strong bilateral relations with some of the outside powers, maybe the United States or others?
It's a really key question. The impact of China on Southeast Asia is, and I come back to this word complex and the word varied again. Some states in Southeast Asia have excellent relations with China, particularly Singapore, Malaysia, to some extent Indonesia, Myanmar still, Cambodia. Other states have been unnerved by what China's been doing in the South China Sea over the last 2 or 3 years, particularly Vietnam, which has an historical adversarial relationship with China, and almost to the same extent Philippines, which is not a strong power in military terms, and at the same time has really important interests in the South China Sea. Both the Philippines and Vietnam have felt quite vulnerable. Yet the whole region remains interested in developing close economic relations with China. they want to benefit from China's economic rise, and so far they have done. So the idea of Southeast Asian states coming together to balance China's rise is almost unthinkable at the moment. None of them are so anxious about their security that they feel compelled to sink their differences with their ASEAN neighbours and form some sort of bloc. Yet at the same time, they are all hedging. They are hedging in the context of ASEAN. There have been tentative moves within ASEAN to develop more dialogue amongst Southeast Asian countries on security and defence matters through the ASEAN Defence Ministers meeting. And at the same time, they're hedging in the sense of developing their security relations with the US. And I mentioned two countries where that's been particularly apparent, Singapore and Vietnam, but it's been happening across the board in Southeast Asia. And also some Southeast Asian states have significant security relations with other outside powers, bilaterally with Australia in some cases, and multilaterally through the five-power defence arrangements. So they're responding to China's assertiveness in a number of ways, but generally in a low-key fashion. And one more aspect, of course, is that they're all to some extent spending a lot more on defence and improving their own national defence capabilities. That's true almost across the board in Southeast Asia. There's been a slight hesitation now on Malaysia's part for domestic political reasons, but in the cases of Vietnam, Singapore, Indonesia, defence spending is increasing quite fast. Not wholly because of China, but partly because of China.
I'd just like to pick up on the China dimension, because one important aspect of the internal politics of a lot of Southeast Asian countries, or several Southeast Asian countries, is of course the role of the Chinese diaspora internally. If you look at Malaysia, for example, the Chinese community is a major component in the opposition movement. In Indonesia, most of the large business owners are ethnic Chinese. So that has a complicating factor in terms of the internal dynamics of several of these countries, especially vis-a-vis China. And I just wonder if you could comment on the possible implications of that and of the way that some of the Chinese communities in Southeast Asia might look to China as a possible guarantor of their own internal security. And you can see that in working out in terms of international politics, in terms of the way that Singaporean foreign policy is oscillating between the two poles of the US security guarantees vis-a-vis the rapprochement between Singapore and mainland China. So I think this is a dimension to Southeast Asian politics, and particularly in terms of foreign policy, which it might be worth commenting on a little bit further.
Yeah. Well, China has for the last 55 years tried to put. This is a matter of policy. China has elevated relations with Southeast Asian governments ahead of relations with ethnic Chinese in Southeast Asia. And they decided in the context of the Cold War that their interests were better served by trying to build as part of their efforts to develop an Afro-Asian bloc, to build relations with Southeast Asian states rather than the ethnic Chinese. And I think Zhou Enlai made that clear in 1955 that effectively ethnic Chinese people in Southeast Asia should see themselves as citizens of the countries in which they reside and not as Chinese people living overseas. And that was I suppose the apogee of that attitude was in 1998 when, in the transition from the Suharto regime in Indonesia, ethnic Chinese people in Jakarta found themselves on the receiving end of what amounted to a small-scale pogrom. And Chinese were being murdered and assaulted in the streets, and China did not respond in any way. And there was a lot of online chatter though, and particularly from Taiwan and Hong Kong and Malaysia, essentially along the lines of why isn't China standing up to protect Chinese? But they did put their relations with the Indonesian state first. And I think that will still be the case. I think that the furthest that China would go in protecting ethnic Chinese in Southeast Asia would be in the sense of talking in strong terms to governments that might have in the region that might have internal problems. But I don't think that even with China's increasing military power and capabilities, that I would be very surprised if there was any thinking in Beijing along the lines that if, for example, there were large-scale disturbances in Indonesia and Malaysia affecting ethnic Chinese, we would go in and help them. I think that their thinking is extremely long-term, and they would be thinking about their long-term strategic relationships with governments in the region. Of course, in talking about ethnic Chinese in Southeast Asia, you could have mentioned Singapore, which is where ethnic Chinese are actually the huge majority of the population, around 80%.
Okay, I have Roz, Mark, and over here, and Eleanor, and I think there's one over there. The sun is kind of bright. What I'd like to do is ask each person to make a very short intervention, because we only have about 5 minutes left, and Tim does have an airplane to catch, and then Tim will try to address each of them. We'll start with Roz.
It was really just to see if you could expand a bit on the role of the US in the region, and specifically in the South China Sea, the growing importance, significance, and resources they're attributing to that area. Thank you.
Go kind of in order of across the room. So, Eleanor?
Okay, this is an idea, perhaps half-baked in my head, that the security and political implications of the one unpredictable outside power, which would be the natural disasters that seem to plague the majority of the countries in Southeast Asia. And in what way? Because in my mind, I immediately think of how the military are involved and other political implications, withholding of aid. You know, does Malaysia weigh in to, say, in Thailand now, where they're facing, you know, flooding? How are the military involved in dealing with the flood disaster? And, you know, what's the political dimensions of handling that sort of thing?
I was just wondering if China's first objective for its assertiveness is to increase its economic power. How would you balance that with its support to Burma, Myanmar, and I know it's not Southeast Asia, but with North Korea, which have nothing to do with the growth of economy? They're basically a burden on the economy.
I think all questions are normally going back to China, which is what we saw over the weekend. Mike already asked about that. And Tim, you also mentioned the hedging of bets with security guarantees with Australia. How do South Korea and Japan fit into the regional equation as well? And do they or can they act as a counterbalance to China's either direct or perceived influence?
looking at that sea as yet another Persian Gulf with oil resources and whatnot, to what extent it's economic as against, I'm a big boy now, I'm going to show my resources?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you about Southeast Asia's stance on the Non-Proliferation Treaty. That's, the first meeting's coming up next year, 2012, in preparation for 2015. Thank you.
Okay, we have questions, the role of the U.S., especially in the South China Sea, the impact of natural disasters, China's objectives, you know, whether they're economic, how does that relate to their relationship with Burma, North Korea, the hedging, security guarantees, the role of Australia, Japan, South Korea, China's assertiveness, and finally the Non-Proliferation Treaty. It's quite a handful.
5 minutes. Yeah. 15 seconds to answer each one. On the South China, the U.S. role in the South China Sea, the U.S. has made it clear that this is not that America does not have a direct stake in this, and I think the U.S. has intimated to the Philippines that although they have an alliance relationship, this does not extend to the United States bailing out the Philippines if it gets itself into an armed conflict in the South China Sea with China. However, the United States has also made it clear that it has a vital national interest in ensuring that freedom of passage, freedom of navigation and commerce through the South China Sea is maintained, and that the present conflicts there should not impede the free use of international waters in the South China Sea. The US also has other interests in the South China Sea relating to the freedom of its naval and air assets to gather intelligence on the coast of China. And of course that's been a source of tension with China going back to the EP3 incident of 10 years ago. But and I think there's every indication that the US is determined to maintain what it sees as its rights under international law to gather intelligence, even if it's within China's exclusive economic zone, but outside territorial waters and airspace. The second point, Eleanor asked about natural disasters, and of course this is actually an important theme that has emerged in the context of the Shangri-La dialogue, in which the ASEAN countries are all quite heavily invested, and we've talked about this in plenary sessions and in breakout groups every year for the last 5 or 6 years. And you're absolutely right that Southeast Asian countries, I suppose, because it is a particularly tectonic region as well as being a maritime region, it's particularly prone to flooding and volcanic eruptions and earthquakes and tsunamis, and we've seen the impact of the tsunami in Indonesia and flooding in Thailand, and in every case there's been substantial military involvement, and the Thai army is now working around the clock to keep the floodwaters out of Bangkok. In some cases, this does involve cooperation across borders. For example, in the Indonesian tsunami disaster in Aceh, there was substantial involvement by the United States, by India, by Singapore, and numerous other countries' armed forces in the disaster relief effort. And so a lot of thinking is going into what is known as HADR, humanitarian and disaster relief operations. And that's actually quite a good way of building confidence between armed forces, because it doesn't because it's focusing on a non-state challenge. It's not pointing in any particular direction in terms of looking for threats. So.
As well, it's say within Thailand, but the Thai government now, some panicking in some way that the Thai military are on the streets, recovering Thailand. How do they pull them back again? With this interplay internally between the military.
No, I don't think they see it like that. They see it as actually quite good, because it gives the Thai army a very useful role. And it's good for the army in that it maintains their relevance and popularity, but at the same time it's not direct political involvement. So I don't think they see it in that way. China and its relations with North Korea and Myanmar. The strategic context is that I think that China does not like to see other major powers implanted around its periphery, and it likes to have a sense of influence around its periphery. And I think its role in relation to North Korea and Myanmar is not. These are not essentially economic relationships, although in Myanmar's case there are economic benefits for China. It's really about taking advantage of opportunities to enhance political and strategic influence in neighboring countries. Mark, South Korea and Japan. Well, I mean, there's some truth in that ASEAN has the inner circle of ASEAN is the 10 Southeast Asian countries, but through various mechanisms over the years, ASEAN has attempted to construct a regional security architecture that includes all those powers which have an interest in East Asian security, and to some extent Asia-Pacific security more broadly defined. So it does that particularly nowadays through the East Asian Summit and through the ASEAN, what's called the ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting Plus. And South Korea and Japan are heavily involved in those larger meetings, as they are in the Shangri-La Dialogue. And the economic interests of South Korea and Japan in Southeast Asia are huge. I mean, all the talk is about China nowadays, but actually Japan's economic stake in Southeast Asia is much larger than China's. I think the problem, though, from a Southeast Asian perspective, is that Japan's economy has been in stasis for the last 20 years, and also that now seems to be matched by a sort of political stasis and a lack of direction in Japanese policy globally, and including in relation to Southeast Asia. So Southeast Asian countries in general, I think, have got over their post-Second World War antipathy towards Japan, which was particularly strong in the cases of Philippines and Singapore. So they would be happy to see greater involvement, but I don't think it's going to happen on any significant scale. China's, yes, I mean, I think in the South China Sea, oil and the potential for oil and gas are huge issues, and that there is an economic rationale, an economic basis for the intensification of the territorial disputes there over the last 2 or 3 years. It is not coincidental that China needs massive resources, and there they are in an area which has traditionally been claimed as part of China's maritime territory, which some of these, from China's perspective, pesky Southeast Asian countries are also claiming. I think there's a heavy economic rationale there. Southeast Asia and the NPT. Well, Southeast Asian countries have all forsworn nuclear weapons ambitions. There has been some discussion over the last several years about whether Myanmar has a nuclear weapons program, and there were some tentative indications, and I know that Des Ball from the ANU in particular is convinced that Myanmar is doing something nefarious connected with nuclear weapons, and there is evidence of some sort of links with North Korea on this, but I mean our sense is that whatever links there were probably truncated several years ago, and that there is in all probability nothing going on in Myanmar now that's connected with nuclear weapons. Virtually all Southeast Asian countries have civilian nuclear ambitions, and the IISS has done quite a bit of work on those in recent years, and we produced a dossier on Southeast Asian nuclear programs. But overall, they have a policy of not developing nuclear weapons. They're strongly supportive of the NPT, and indeed there's been a Southeast Asian nuclear weapon-free zone in place for several decades. So I think all the evidence is that they are among the strongest supporters of the NPT.
Thank you, Tim. Before I ask everyone here to thank you for a very rich and insightful presentation, as you said, in a very complex region of the world, or sub-region. Eleanor, are there any upcoming Global Perspective series? Okay, so we will be letting everyone know as soon as we have the next session scheduled. With that, I'd like everyone to please thank Tim for an excellent presentation, and best wishes to catch your airplane in time to get home. All right, thank you.
Thank you.